Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Star Wars video. In this one I'm going to talk about what's next for Star Wars. Post-sequel trilogy being over, what should be the plan, what is the plan, and where do they go? Because the main reason for this is ultimately that I think a lot of people are asking this question, and that clearly I think anyone at this point can agree with the idea that the sequel trilogy would have been better if it was planned out from the start. There was some good ideas, they had good actors and stuff like that. They just really suffered from the fact that they switched it between directors every movie and clearly had no planning really between it for the most part. So you know, it was definitely a messy time period for Star Wars throughout the whole thing. In that I think Disney, in so many ways, you can look back on their sort of ownership of Star Wars since they took over and just see disaster after disaster after disaster with not that many positives. So they definitely have to really improve things going into the sort of new era for them. So I think straight away we have to start off with TV shows. I think the future of Star Wars ultimately is away from movies. They will come back to them eventually, but I think it probably is for the best that they're going to take a 2-3 year break before they do another movie again. That I do think is the best way to go. And then when they come back, they should come back with a completely new time period, which we'll get to in just a minute. But TV shows, I think for now, should be what they focus on for Star Wars over the next handful of years, and realistically I think going forward. Because if you look at the main critical reaction to the sequel trilogy, most of it ultimately does come down to, you know, effectively, they didn't have the time, episode count basically, to tell the detail of a story that people wanted. What does? TV shows. So that's why The Mandalorian has been such a success. That's why Baby Yoda is the biggest household name in Star Wars basically, and probably in so many ways the biggest Star Wars thing since the start of Star Wars. Like, it's maybe over exaggerating a bit, but like that's how widespread the love of Baby Yoda is. And in general, I saw nothing but positives in terms of the reaction to, especially like the finale of The Mandalorian and the setup for the next season. So that's a huge success on their part. And we already know that there's other TV series in planning. So the two that they have confirmed so far are the Cassian Andor TV series as well as the Obi-Wan Kenobi TV series. We'll start with some discussion about the Cassian Andor show. And because this is the one I think there's a little bit more sort of skeptical stuff going on about, in that most people I think like Rogue One. I think it's fine. I don't think it's one of the best Star Wars movies, in that I think it ultimately is one of those stories where, like, if they had told that story in a novel, I think it would have been just as fine as telling it as a movie. Like, I don't think it was necessarily the biggest story that you needed to tell in that format, but it was well done for what it was. Cassian Andor himself is a perfectly fine character. Is he enough of a draw to build a whole series around? That is the question, which is why I would definitely lean in the direction of hoping that series decides to more name itself like the Rebel Alliance show style thing. Not have it be the Cassian Andor show, that the show's actually called something related to his name. And have it be more like he is the main character of a show that is in general covering stuff dealing with sort of the Rebel Alliance kind of intelligence gathering side of things. That way it becomes your sort of Clone Wars in that Empire versus Rebellion era, in that you can deal with the very war-heavy stuff that Rogue One actually dealt with, and cover more of the sort of battlegrounds, battlefields, intelligence gathering of the main conflict between the Empire and the Rebellion. Basically the stuff that most of the material hasn't really covered when it comes to the overall military sort of engagements back and forth between the Rebellion and the Empire. Of course, like, he's going to be the main character, and that, like, the rumors are that, like, it seems like we're going to get flashback type stuff in there. So basically the idea here is that, like, okay, like, fine, you're using him as your main character, but don't have it be like the be all end all. Definitely have a bigger, more extended cast, and just have him sort of be the centerpiece of it. That's my thoughts on that. I wouldn't say I'm overly excited for that, but I've been very impressed with The Mandalorian, so I'll definitely give that one a chance. The Obi-Wan Kenobi series is obviously going to be a much easier sell for a lot of other people, but they do have that real challenge on their hands of, we basically know it's set in between episode 3 and 4. That, given the age of Ewan McGregor and stuff like that, that's where it has to be. But what is the plot of that series? What is a 3 to 4 season long show about Obi-Wan Kenobi set in that time period? What makes up 30, 40 episodes of a show like that? That's where you maybe encounter some issues in that, like, okay, he's on Tatooine, he's looking over Luke. So you get an actor to play young Luke, you cover some interactions with them, issues with like the Sand people and stuff like that, but does that make up that many episodes? And that's where I would definitely be like, you have to really emphasize the fact that he is a Jedi. You can't, in the Obi-Wan Kenobi show, forget that he's a Jedi. In that, if we don't see him ever use the lightsaber in the entire show, you're going to disappoint a lot of people. So I'd probably, with a show like this, more want them to sort of emphasize like flashback, pretty heavily use flashback and show snippets and moments from the Clone Wars. And you can bring in like actors to play those other characters, other Jedi, Hayden Christensen, cameo moments like that. Because ultimately, you are eventually building, I think, in that Obi-Wan Kenobi series, to moments like all of his key interactions with Luke, in terms of, I think most people get the impression he probably interacted with Luke maybe a little bit more early on, when Luke was younger, and then that's when Owen Lars came in and basically said, no, stay away from him, and Luke in recent times hasn't really interacted with Ben up until episode 4 actually happens. So the other thing then would be, when and how does Obi-Wan find out that this new Darth Vader person is Anakin? And what does he do? What is his reaction to that? Plus the other thing would be Obi-Wan learning the whole becoming one with the Force ability, and, you know, connecting with Qui-Gon, Yoda, that sort of stuff. So there's some key moments you can get to, but a lot of that is kind of just, you know, him meditating in his hut. So does he ever leave the planet? How does some of this stuff actually happen or come about? And that's why I definitely be like, have an incident on Tatooine link in with maybe something he's experienced before in his Jedi training. And that's where I'd be like, yeah, go to Clone Wars, be willing to maybe go back to an even younger, like really young Padawan Obi-Wan. Like, you know, 12-year-old Padawan Obi-Wan and stuff like that. That way, you know, you can bring in a new actor to play Obi-Wan at that age. You have a new actor to play Qui-Gon at that age. That's the interesting stuff you can get out of this by, like, just, you know, it's the Obi-Wan series. It's not the between episode 3 and 4 Obi-Wan, it's him as a character. So in the same way that in The Mandalorian we're getting Din's backstory, we can get more of Obi-Wan's backstory in this as well. In that, like, who wouldn't want to see like a little flashback of him remembering Satine and show a live action Satine? And then because he is a Jedi Council member and stuff like that, you can just show a just quick flashback sequence where he like learns something from another one of the masters or something like that, where like it's flashback sequence, it's Obi-Wan and Kit Fisto doing something. That way, like, okay, you probably have to stay away from like Mace Windu because you might not be able to bring Samuel L. Jackson back in, but, you know, Kit Fisto is one of those characters that, because it's mainly the makeup, it doesn't really matter who plays him necessarily. Once you match the look of the character and get the Nautilin design right, that works. Similarly with anyone like Eth Koth or any other member of the Jedi Council, you have the ability to do that. Not to mention, Yoda is always an option. And I think that's going to be one of the things that the Obi-Wan Kenobi show is probably going to have to do, because I think a lot of people may struggle with that if it is just, you know, struggling on Tatooine, Obi-Wan just staying undercover, a little incident here and there with the Sand people, in one of the cantinas, somewhere around Tatooine. Like, you know, that only works so far. There's only so much, you know, nostalgia about Tatooine that you can get into before you kind of grow a little bit tired of, like, we've had a lot of Star Wars on Tatooine, can we have something more going on? So that's the challenge with the Obi-Wan series, and that he's such a beloved character, but you have to have him doing interesting things. And perhaps that time period doesn't allow you as much leeway as possible. The other thing would be like Darth Maul. Now, ultimately, we know Rebels has dealt with Darth Maul, but there's still, certain time periods and stuff like that they're still dealing with, in the sense that we know season 7 of the Clone Wars is going to feature Darth Maul, and then there's like a comic series that covers like another transitionary point for Maul, and then there's the solo appearance from him. So, I don't think it's out of the picture completely that there is a sort of in-between encounter again of Obi-Wan versus Maul, in that he realistically would be in exile knowing that Maul is still alive out there somewhere. So him going somewhere to encounter Maul, and leading eventually to Maul's exile when he's found in Rebels, would be pretty good. And then we know Rebels is the ending of Maul. That's always like a cool thing in terms of a conflict that Obi-Wan can have with his rival. But we'll move on from there. So they're the two series that are planned. I think they should be successful, both of them. One more sort of solo character focused, maybe just referencing more prequel style stuff. One more directly focused on just Rebellion Empire time period. The other thing, though, is that coming out in just a few weeks, in February, is Star Wars The Clone Wars Season 7. And this, I think, is probably going to end up surprising a bunch of people who are maybe back into Star Wars because of The Mandalorian, or excited about Star Wars because, 9 just brought everyone sort of back into Star Wars and talking about it again. Everyone, I think, is going to be a bit surprised with just how popular and impressive The Clone Wars is going to be with Season 7. So I think you're going to see a lot more interest in the Clone Wars, that both in terms of discussing the first 6 seasons, but also in terms of how impactful Season 7 is going to be, in that all they have to do is get it out there very clearly that if you want to know more about some of the Mandalorian stuff going on in relation to The Mandalorian show, watch the Clone Wars, because it covers a large part of that stuff with the Darksaber, in that you just put out a trailer basically called the Darksaber for Season 7 of the Clone Wars, and link it to the fact that it's the same thing from The Mandalorian, you'll get people watching the Clone Wars. So they have the ability to do that. Not to mention Ahsoka, they must know, is such a fan favorite character. This is a key part of her arc in terms of transitioning from her leaving the Jedi Order at the end of Season 5 to finally being reintroduced to set up the Ahsoka novel, plus where she is in Rebels. So there's all those type of things that have to still happen and come together. And hopefully, if it's successful enough, I would like to see if they maybe consider at some point, making the other episodes happen that weren't fully confirmed. The stuff that they did in other material, the Darth Maul arc they did as a comic series, the Ventress arc they did as a book, Dark Disciple, and then Son of Dathomir, I think, is the Darth Maul one. They were both meant to be arcs in the Clone Wars Season 7 and 8, but since they got obviously cancelled until the revival of Season 7 here, they aren't doing them. I'd love to see, if this is popular enough, them go back to that, because especially something like Dark Disciple, because Ventress is a Clone Wars character inherently, I want her full arc to be there in the animation, and not just, oh, you're interested in her arc up to here, but then you have to switch over to the book. Same with Maul. I think they're two arcs that would very much be worth kind of going back over and doing. Just seeing some more Clone Wars get confirmed would be something nice, but maybe it is the time to kind of, just accept Season 7 is the last season. Either way. So, still on the animated stuff, there's been rumors recently that they might be doing another animated series to cover as a sequel after Rebels. And this absolutely makes sense, because Rebels did end with some pretty big kind of cliffhanger plot points in terms of direct setups for clearly another big story about to happen. Sabine and Ahsoka going out in search of Ezra after his sort of sacrifice to save the day. Ezra is still out there somewhere with Thrawn, so both of those characters you're invested in, you want to know what's going on with them. Where are they? Is it unknown regions? Is this how you kind of properly, in terms of bigger canon than the books, introduce the Chiss ascendancy into things and do something there? There's always the potential for like the Yuzhang Vong to be eventually introduced as like a galaxy kind of wide threat at some point, but can you really fit it in with some of the stuff that happens? I'm not entirely sure, but that would be definitely a very interesting one in that I do want to see the end of like Ezra's arc. I do want to see, basically, like what his dynamic with Sabine is like, and that she's very much sort of devoted herself at this point to finding him, and Ahsoka is going to help her do that. Like, is there a relationship there? Thrawn always has been like one of the more interesting Star Wars characters, and the new novels are actually very good for him, and he was, decently done in the Clone Wars show, given that they had to have him kind of lose most of the battles he fought in because he wasn't like our main character, he was just the villain, but there's still potential. So a follow-up to Rebels could work because it would immediately get rid of sort of the problem that Rebels had, which was just like a lot of episodes that didn't feel particularly important. This would clearly, I think, have to be a more plot-directed series where your main characters are Ahsoka and Sabine and maybe cutting over to Ezra. There's not as much time like some of the other series to have with just random characters doing random things, and you're just kind of like, get to the point. So I'd like to see a very focused animated show covering the Rebel stuff, because I think Ahsoka is one of those characters you have to tell every stage of her story. I think it's very important to do that, and I'd love to see if they decide to ever put her in live action. It was interesting that she was one of the voices in The Rise of Skywalker, but they didn't ever decide to really show her in person. So yeah, that's TV series, both live action and animated, covered. Let's get into movies. So we know they're taking a break, obviously. That clearly even they sort of acknowledge they can't just go ahead doing movies the same way that they were doing them up to now. Chopping and changing directors in the middle of production. We're not happy with this guy, get rid of him. We're not happy with this guy, get rid of him. Let's swap directors between movies without a plan. It's not good enough. They can't do that. So they're taking the time clearly to, I suppose, plan some stuff, get some solid directors in place to actually make some stuff happen. Now, all of the rumors are suggesting that, like, potentially Rian Johnson still has a trilogy of movies that he's on board for, but I think the second the reaction to the Last Jedi happened, that was pretty much kind of put on hold straight away, because that name attached to anything Star Wars is just kind of tainted to a degree. That it is going to take reintroducing him slowly to Star Wars to in any way get him to be accepted. And I think that is realistically stuff like if he directs an episode of like The Mandalorian season 2 and it's a good episode, people are like, okay, maybe it was just Rian Johnson in the movie system during the sequel trilogy, the way they were doing it, that's why it turned out the way it did. He's not actually as terrible as we think. Like, it's always going to be a struggle, though, given what he did to Luke Skywalker, for so many people to be able to get behind him. But, if he does have a trilogy, he has a trilogy, and it's going to be something new, so he can't make the same mistakes he made with the sequel trilogy of basically messing too much with established, characters that people care about. It'd just be his own stuff. So there's some potential there, but either way, like there's something planned there. Three movies there. Benioff and Weiss, who aren't on board their project anymore, I think also were confirmed for either a trilogy or a couple of movies, and we don't know about that. I think their one was the rumored kind of like Old Republic style thing, which to me is the main thing that I'd want. And it also seems to be the most sort of heavily rumored direction that they'd go in that you see reports of like, oh, this is the Old Republic thing, oh, it's going to be set here, no, it'll be set here, it'll be about Revan, no, it'll be about this. But I do ultimately feel that any movie that they do, that has to be the direction that they go in. I think they're going to stay away from going on too far past Episode 9 going forward, just because it doesn't seem like they necessarily are going to be able to get the actors back anytime soon. And without them, can you really do that much with movies past Episode 9? I'm not particularly sure. That leaves going way before Episode 1 completely open, because there's basically nothing in the new canon about it apart from content of late beginning to reference it, of like, there were these legendary battles of old, like Mandalorian versus the Jedi. The Visual Dictionary for Rise of Skywalker recently gave us the names of past Sith Lords, which are very similar, of course. They're identical to some of the ones from the EU. So it's like, okay, Revan's back, Darth Tenebrous, Darth Ondedu, these type of names are back. Are they the same as from the EU, or what? Can we actually tell some of these stories? Because it actually is, I think, honestly, where they should go, because it is one of the most interesting concepts. Just having, it immediately changes things. Going from the originals and the sequel trilogy both taking the approach of only having a couple of Force users, I think they need to transition that back into the other way of lots of Jedi, lots of Sith. And immediately you're asking the question of like, oh, what's that like? What was it actually like when the Sith weren't just two? When the Sith actually had an army of Force users, an army of Lords. What was that era actually like? How did the Jedi combat the Sith when they were right out there in the open? What was the galaxy like at that point? In terms of you're going back to a time when the Jedi Order isn't so heavily interlinked to the Senate and stuff like that. They're more of a independent system. They still sort of ultimately support the Republic, but they're not like beholden to them in a way. They can act on their own if they want to. What's that era like? In that this is just the Jedi on their own, having formed, from Octo and whatever, the first Jedi, and eventually it's this big thing. But also, the Sith are a big army as well, and you have basically Force wars as being the main thing. It's no longer that like it's two armies that happen to have some of the higher ups be Force users. Instead, pretty much it's just a battle. Light side and dark side is the battle, and everyone knows about it. Everyone in the entire world in this era is aware of the fact that the Sith are a thing, the Jedi are a thing. They know what the Force is because there's so many Force users. That's, I think, the path that you have to go on. That's a super interesting concept. You immediately have much more lightsabers, and you can still have it be the thing where like the main characters are the standouts from the Jedi Order and the standouts from the Sith. And that's where you can immediately tell that Darth Revan story if you want to. Really reference that Knights of the Old Republic stuff and tell the really interesting kind of back and forth story of Revan, his conflict with the light, his conflict with the darkness, and him ending up to somewhere in the middle, and all the stuff that happens there. The war at the Mandalorians, because that seems to sort of in a way be the sort of connecting tissue at the moment that they're trying to build towards right now in Star Wars. It's linking stuff together through the Mandalorians. They're in the Clone Wars. They're now doing it in this like post Episode 6 era of the Mandalorian, with the way it is right now, different from how it was in the Clone Wars, and they're teasing the legacy of the Mandalorians from the past of there was a Mandalorian Jedi who had the Darksaber, but there was also wars between the Mandalorian and the Jedi. How did that happen? Who led that? That sort of thing. So I think that's probably a good place to go to. A lot of people have been speculating that that's exactly what they want. Go for the Revan story and you can bring everything together. What I'd more want myself is more focus on Darth Bane. Because I feel one of the parts of just the story of the franchise that we need to highlight that little bit more is the idea of the Rule of Two. I think most people are familiar with it because they like reference it, and like in the Clone Wars, like Yoda directly says, to the apparent spirit of Darth Bane, you are Darth Bane, you implemented the Sith Rule of Two. So it's canon that Bane introduced the Rule of Two, it's just we don't know any of the details surrounding it beyond Darth Bane is a Sith, he was this key person. But how did that happen? And I think that's what you need to do in a movie like this, is I really feel telling the story of Bane pretty much almost exactly how it was told in the Darth Bane novels is definitely a good way to go. That way you start with a character who isn't some like randomer who just has grown up on this desert planet. He's an adult. and he's a minor, I believe he is. I haven't read the books in a while, but you know, he's just going about his own way, just, you know, struggling to find his way in the galaxy, and he ends up joining, you know, the army of the Sith. He ends up discovering he's force sensitive and getting involved with, you know, the Sith masters and being trained, and because of how different it is at this point in time with so many Sith lords, of course, it is more militaristic, and some of the sort of ancient aspects of the Sith, the power, the fact that they call themselves Darth and so on, that's gone at this point. And the significance of Bane is that he sees what, once he gets entrenched in them and becomes sort of a higher up, he begins to realize what is wrong with the Sith and why they're not succeeding, and why they're sort of destined in his mind to die out and the Jedi to win. Is because they've lost sight of kind of what they used to be. And so his whole idea is, bring back the title of Darth. Let's not call ourselves Lord this or Lord that anymore. It's Darth. Let's bring back these ancient powers we've forgotten about, and actually try and do something. And so he feels, rather than having numbers, whereas the dark side's, you know, tendency towards chaos leads to it destroying itself, two, it's in such a state of balance that no one would ever dream of, within a rule of two, doing something so, you know, chaotic as to destroy it. And it will just lead to this simple nature of the master trains the apprentice becomes more powerful than the master and kills the master. They take an apprentice of their own, and the cycle just repeats itself. And they grow ever more powerful, just with this one transferring on to the next one, all the while working towards the same goal, the Revenge of the Sith plan, and it culminates with Palpatine, of course. That's the story I think you tell. You focus on a Sith Lord character and really delve into the idea of what the Sith is, because I think it's relatively unexplored in the mainline stuff. Like, throughout the 9 movies of the Skywalker saga, we know what a Sith is, we know what a Sith Lord is, but we don't actually know much about the general philosophy. Just that it is this long plan that came to fruition. Palpatine took over and, you know, became the Emperor. But the second he becomes the Emperor, it's almost like the idea of the Sith is kind of forgotten about. So I think it's kind of important to go back and sort of establish, like, what are the Sith? What were their goals in the first place? Why are they so different than the Jedi? Like, where does that come from? And this is where, like, your options, I think, are to really either go to just the era directly before the prequel era, which is basically the establishment of the rule of two, and the, you know, the hundreds of years before the prequels, when the world is roughly just in that way with the Jedi attached to the Republic. Then you have the era before that, which is the Old Republic, and the Jedi more kind of separate from that. And you have actually, you know, armies of Darths and stuff like that. Or do you go way before that even to ancient Jedi and the establishment of the Jedi Order and stuff like that? I think they're the paths that you probably need to go on, is just go into the history of Star Wars rather than try and go forward beyond that, and just, you know, fill in the stuff that's there rather than just kind of extending the kind of outer reaches type thing. So they're the ideas that I would have straight away for a movie potentially. And then look, along the way you can potentially bring back the idea of your kind of one-off Star Wars story movies, and hopefully, you know, when there's a better sort of atmosphere around the fandom, they'll probably be received that little bit better. So, you know, there's always that potential. The final thing I want to talk about here is basically the other media. So the books, the comics, and video games. To me, the main problem I've had since Disney took over with the new canon stuff has mainly been that they've, for the most part, seemingly been terrified to tell a story that is in any way of note in any of the books that have come out. It feels like the best that they could ever do was just, oh, Phasma doesn't have any character, let's write a book about Phasma where she's actually interesting. And it's a really well written book, but it's fundamentally about this character who was pretty much nothing in the 2 movies she was in, and the book exists as just, this is who she is. And there's nothing of significant importance, I think, in most of the new books that come out, and it's somewhat similar with the comics, that there's they're not touching on, I think, a lot of the ground where I think people tend to focus on when it came to the old EU, the Legends stuff now. And that is the fact that, yeah, they haven't told any Old Republic stories or anything like that in the new canon. They were absolutely terrified of telling any sort of real stories or comics with the sequel era characters, and it's clear that the reason for that is because there was no continuity. That because the people making the movies, the main content, didn't have it all planned, there was no way they were going to have any notable extra content that would link into them. So the best we got was these fairly minor stories that did pretty basic stuff with the characters, or completely about like really minor characters. So that's the best that we got. Like, we never got anything resembling the movie, the type of books that we got in the lead into all the prequels, where like you had Cloak of Deception leading into Phantom Menace, you had Approaching Storm leading into Attack of the Clones, and then you had Labyrinth of Evil leading into Revenge of the Sith. Plus with that, with Revenge of the Sith, they also had Dark Lord of the Sith, Rise of Darth Vader to follow it up directly. All of those books are actually quite good at building on what's there and having some actually important stuff happen. Not to mention, in the prequels, you of course had the introduction of Gennady Tartakovsky's Clone Wars series, which built anticipation for Revenge of the Sith, which did a very good job, and you followed up Episode 3 with the Clone Wars series. So that was really well done. I don't feel like most of the framework is there to do that for the sequel trilogy, because they're finally actually doing an important story, but it's like, why is it happening so late? Why is this Rise of Kylo Ren comic series? Why is this story only being told right now? Why wasn't this story told back in 2015 with The Force Awakens? Why wasn't it told with Last Jedi? Why is it now? Post episode 7, 8, and 9. Now we need to get the backstory in Kylo Ren, not beforehand to add to his arc. No, it's now a add-on after the fact, after his death, to his arc. That's the problem. And it's the fact that, like, yeah, they had to wait until episode 9 was basically locked in to tell this story, because they didn't know what the story was, and that's the big thing. So I hope now that the sequel trilogy is over, you can tell some important stories. Like, I've always maintained that for me, the best ever Star Wars book is this one, Star Wars Darth Plagueis, because it features Darth Plagueis as a main character. It features Palpatine as a main character during his training, and covers and touches on a lot of very interesting ground. When it comes to the Sith, their ideals, they talk a lot about the history of the Sith, so there's a lot of other Dark Lords of the Sith that get mentioned throughout this. It delves really in depth into the whole midichlorians thing, and the idea of, like, Plagueis being the person who could, save people from dying. What was exactly meant by that, and his ability to manipulate midichlorians, and so on. And the reason, like, Darth Maul is on the back is because, it ties into him as well. The whole plan, it's amazing connective tissue between episode 1 and all the stuff kind of before that, of getting across that Palpatine's plan was not just his own plan, but it was linked into a lot of the Sith that came before. It was this growing plan, this growing kind of threat that culminates with Palpatine, and I think it was just so well done and impactful. It's a book that I think all Star Wars fans should read, because it covers such interesting ground. The same with the Darth Bane books, and that, like, yeah, I want to know how the Rule of Two started. Who is Darth Bane? Why did he do it? How did it change? What were the Jedi like at that time? Those type of things. There are books which I do want to get to. I haven't read them yet at some point, where they cover, like, the origin of the Jedi Order. They sound really interesting because they're sort of different. Whereas, a lot of what we get these days are, these very vague books, like Before the Awakening, Journey to the Force Awakens, Journey to the Last Jedi, Journey to the Rise of Skywalker, and it's like, oh, here's a book about some of the people in Canto Bight who apparently have names, but they didn't say them in the movies, but we're going to focus the whole book on them. That sort of stuff. Here's this bounty hunter from episode 7. Let's have to have a whole book focused on him. He got, like, a toy, but no one knows his name. Those type of things. that's exactly what they didn't need to do, but it's exactly what they did. So hopefully we're in an era now where they can tell more stories, and that, like, if you look at like the timeline of books and stuff like that they put in before any of the new books, like, it's really empty. Like, the timeline is there's nothing there. Like, this is like, what's this book? I haven't read this one yet, Resistance Reborn, but like that's the timeline. That's like every book basically in the whole franchise. There's like 2 set before episode 1, nothing in between 1 and 2. There's the Clone Wars TV series and Dark Disciple between episodes 2 and 3. There's Catalyst, Lords of the Sith, Tarkin, the Thrawn books, these type of things. And it's like, okay, like, that's great and all, but like, there's nothing. I don't look at this book series here and think, yeah, there's tons of stuff I want to know about. It's like, no, there's just like, here's a bunch of characters who are in a fighter squad, let's write 2-3 books about them. Here's 2 or 3 books about this type of thing, and it's like, that's not that interesting, you know. Cover more ground on like backstory of like characters we care about and that sort of thing. But that's just where they need to go with that sort of thing. On the video game front, I think it was interesting that, like, at the same time as The Mandalorian was happening, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order came out. I played that game and loved it. I think it was just great for once to have a Star Wars game that was single player. It wasn't hinged completely on multiplayer and all this like extra stuff, getting EXP to do this and that. It's a story-driven game. It's basically a prequel era game, even though it's between episodes 3 and 4, but it's more prequel than I think the era afterwards. It feels that way anyway. And, you know, while I don't think the story is as impactful as maybe I thought it would be going in, it's still a very nicely done story that leaves some stuff open for a sequel. I would love to see a sequel and them to just go a little bit more in on the story, get to learn more about these characters. But the gameplay was good. The bit of story that was there, I liked. And I had no major problems with the game, apart from maybe it felt like a little short. The other side of things, Star Wars Battlefront, I think they've completely turned the corner on that game. When that came out, that was one of the most criticized games I've ever seen. Like, I may have this fact wrong, but it's something along the line of like the most ever like downvoted comment on Reddit was like EA's response to the Star Wars Battlefront controversy. And I feel that game is just so different now. They completely took out all of that, you know, microtransaction-y type stuff of surrounding like, this is how you unlock the heroes and this and that. And it's now, I think, a much better game in that, like, I came back to it and, oh, all the heroes are unlocked from the start. You still have to, of course, play with them to unlock all of their, you know, abilities and level up their abilities, but you can do that fairly quickly just by playing the game and putting in a little bit of time with like some of the co-op modes and stuff like that makes it fairly easy. And you know, they still have like some microtransaction stuff in there with regards to skins and so on, but the pricing of it is all like fairly okay, in that the only expensive stuff is basically skins for heroes and some of the better like kind of clone trooper classes and stuff like that. And even then, if you play the game even just for a handful of hours every day, like you build up enough credits to get that stuff. In that I played it a lot over Christmas up until now, and I had enough credits to get like the, you know, Clone Wars Obi-Wan Kenobi skin, to get the right skins for all the clone troopers stuff that I wanted. And I still have a decent amount of credits left over. I didn't have to spend anything extra on the game. Now, if I wanted to unlock every single skin at the moment, yeah, I'd have to either play a lot or buy some of the, crystals that there are. But it's nowhere near what it was. Plus, I think the gameplay is just so much better now as well, because I think the biggest thing that they did, in addition to just bringing in more heroes, was to bring in, what do they call them, reinforcement units. When the game launched, I believe there was only like 2 per faction, in that, like, if you played as the Empire, you had your 4 main classes of like assault, heavy, officer, and specialist, the kind of default standard class, and then your battle points you could spend on like vehicles if you were playing one of those modes, or you could be like a death trooper or like a jetpack trooper. And that was pretty much it for all of the factions, except they replaced the Death Trooper with like a Wookiee for like the Resistance and the Rebel and the Clone Army. And what was it on the other faction? It was Flame Trooper was at this when the game first came out for the First Order. Now, if you play as the clones, you can play as an ARC Trooper, you can play as a Clone Commando. It's so much more fun because you have those options. You can still play as the Wookiee or the Jet Trooper, but you can play as them as well. And so a lot of the times, like when the game first launched, it'd be like, oh, I finally have enough battle points to play as a hero. Oh, a good player who got enough points very early in the game is still like Obi-Wan or Anakin. And there's no more space for heroes because of the way the game functions for balance. So you'd have to hope that one of your teammates died so you could play as the hero, or you just had to have a perfect game at the start. Now, though, even if you can't play as one of the heroes, you can spend about half the amount of points and play as like a Clone Commando, who's a much more powerful unit than like a Heavy or an Assault class, and has like really cool abilities of its own, and is kind of like a mini hero. And because like it's not as good as a hero, but it's better than the standard troopers, and the pricing, like you basically get like 2 lives as like a Clone Commando compared to like 1 life as say like Anakin or Obi-Wan. And I think it's just so much fun, all of the factions and the different ones that they have. They just have to introduce some more reinforcements for, I think, the Rebellion and the Empire, because they've done it for the Clone Wars era stuff and the sequel era stuff, but they're still fairly limited on the original trilogy front. But still, I really like playing Battlefront 2 now, and they really turned the corner on that. So it's kind of like I'm kind of back in on that. So on the video game side of things, like, I think Jedi Fallen Order 2 is an absolute go-to. And then I think probably what people would like to see is maybe something like a newly done kind of Knights of the Old Republic. Full canon story, you know, there's no questionable stuff about is it canon anymore. I'd love to see that. So something along those lines where, like, if the movies are covering this period, then the game can be like an RPG style Star Wars thing that covers this period. I think it's turned around a little bit on the video game side of things, so that was definitely good to see. But yeah, that's this video. Just some thoughts on what's next for Star Wars. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts are on pretty much everything happening now with Star Wars. What are your thoughts on the upcoming Cassian Andor show, the Obi-Wan show, Clone Wars Season 7, a potential Rebels sequel at some point? Where do you think the books and comics should go? And I suppose most importantly, what should the next films be about? I definitely want your thoughts on what should be next for Star Wars. But that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.